In the heart of the galaxy, on a small planet far from the bustling cities of the Empire, a war was brewing. It wasn't a war of nations or races, but of survival. For the humans living there, this planet had become a refuge, a place where they could live free from the oppression of the mighty X-Lore Empire. But this peace was fragile, and the arrival of a X-Lore warship was a sign that their peaceful existence was about to end. Among the humans was David Hayes, a former soldier who had left the chaos of war behind him. He had found a small, quiet life in a settlement on the edge of the desert. Here he worked as a mechanic, fixing anything that needed repair. He wasn't a hero. He didn't think of himself as anything special. But fate has a way of pulling people into situations they never expected. It was a day like any other when the X-Lore warship appeared. It descended from the sky, its shadow looming over the small village. The people were terrified. They had heard stories of the X-Lore, a race of powerful, cold-hearted aliens who had enslaved countless civilizations across the galaxy. The X-Lore didn't ask questions. They took what they wanted and destroyed anything that stood in their way. David had seen his fair share of battles. He knew there was no point in fighting the X-Lore with force. They were too powerful. Instead, he gathered the villagers and led them into hiding, hoping they could escape the coming storm. But as he was preparing to retreat, he heard a cry, a child's cry. He turned to see a young alien girl no more than 5 years old standing in the middle of the street. Her large silver eyes were wide with fear as she watched the X-Lore soldiers advance. The girl didn't seem to belong to the humans in the settlement, and yet she was here, unprotected. David knew in an instant that she needed help. Without thinking, David ran toward her. The soldiers noticed him immediately, their weapons aimed at him in a flash. He didn't care. His focus was on the child. He reached her just as the first blast fired from the X-Lore blaster. The shot struck him in the side, sending him crashing to the ground. He gritted his teeth, pushing through the pain, and shielded the girl with his body. "Get down," he shouted at her, his voice barely a whisper. The child trembled beneath him, but she didn't move. David could feel the heat of the blaster burns against his back, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't. The soldiers stepped forward, their leader, Commander Vixira, ordering them to seize the child. But when they saw David's actions, they hesitated. This human had protected the child with his life. There was something strange about it. A human protecting an alien child from the most powerful empire in the galaxy. "Take him," Vixira ordered, her voice cold as ice. She was a tall, imposing figure, her armor gleaming in the sun. She had seen countless acts of bravery, but this human sacrifice was different. There was something about it that caught her attention. The soldiers grabbed David, lifting him roughly off the ground. He tried to resist, but the pain from the blaster wound was too much. His vision blurred and he fell unconscious in their grip. Hours later, David awoke to find himself in a strange, high-tech cell. His body ached and his wounds burned with the sting of infection. But it wasn't just the pain that made him uneasy. It was the place. The walls around him were made of metal, the air sterile and the lights dim. He could hear the hum of the ship's engines in the distance, and he realized with growing dread that he was aboard the X-Lore warship. David wasn't sure how much time had passed since he had been shot, but he knew he was no longer on the planet. The fact that he had been captured was no surprise. The X-Lore didn't leave prisoners. But why had they spared him? Why hadn't they killed him like they did with so many others? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise. The door to the cell slid open and a tall figure stepped inside. It was Vixira, the commander he had seen earlier. She stood in the doorway watching him with piercing eyes. "You're awake," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. David tried to sit up, but his body refused to cooperate. His side throbbed where the blaster had hit him. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "You're aboard my ship," Vixira replied, "and you are fortunate to still be alive." David didn't know how to respond to that. He had no idea what the X-Lore wanted with him, but he couldn't help but notice the curious expression on Vixira's face. It was as though she was studying him, trying to understand something. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice stronger now. Vixira took a step forward, her boots clicking on the metal floor. "You protected that child," she said, her voice softening slightly. "A human protecting an alien child. That is unusual." David's heart skipped a beat. The child. She was still alive. He hadn't failed her. He hadn't been able to save her from the soldiers, but at least she wasn't dead. And for that he felt a small measure of relief. What happens to her? He asked, his eyes narrowing. Vixera paused, her eyes cold and unreadable. She is my daughter, she said simply, and she will be returned to me. But you are an interesting creature. David didn't understand. What did she mean by interesting? He had protected the child because it was the right thing to do. But now he was a prisoner, and worse, he was in the hands of an alien commander who seemed to find him more fascinating than anything else. You should have killed me, David said, his voice low. I don't deserve to be alive. Vixera stepped closer, her expression softening for the first time. Perhaps, she said, but for now you will remain alive, and you will tell me everything about your kind, human. David's heart raced. He had no idea what the ex-lore wanted, but he knew one thing for sure. His life was no longer his own. The future, it seemed, had a different plan for him, and so David's fate was sealed. The human who had once been a simple mechanic was now a prisoner of the ex-lore, his actions unknowingly setting him on a path that would change the course of history. He had protected an alien child with his life, but what he didn't know was that this sacrifice would lead him into the heart of an empire that would soon learn that not all humans were the same. David was about to learn that the true cost of his heroism had only just begun. The days aboard the ex-lore warship felt like weeks to David. His injuries had been treated, but the healing process was slow. Every movement caused pain, and he was kept in a sterile cell, its walls cold and unyielding. The ship was massive, far larger than any human vessel he had ever seen, with technology that was beyond anything humans had even dreamed of. David spent most of his time lying on the cot, staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. He had always prided himself on being a survivor, but now, in the clutches of the ex-lore, he wasn't sure if survival meant anything at all. He had protected an alien child, and now he was paying the price. But what was the true price? What did the ex-lore want with him? His thoughts were interrupted one morning when the door to his cell opened again. It wasn't the usual guards who entered, but someone far more powerful, Commander Vixera. She looked down at him, her dark eyes unreadable, her posture as rigid as ever. She was tall, with sharp features, and her armor gleamed under the harsh lights of the ship's hallways. David winced as he sat up, his muscles protesting the effort. What do you want now? He asked, his voice hoarse from the lack of use. Vixera said nothing at first. She simply stepped inside, her gaze focused on him, as though assessing his every move. After a long silence, she spoke. You were an anomaly, human, she said. Her voice was soft but carried authority. Your kind do not act as you did. You protected her, the child, without hesitation, without thought for your own life. Why? David narrowed his eyes. He had expected to hear threats, demands, or even torture, but this questioning was something else entirely. It caught him off guard. He had no answer for her. It was instinct, plain and simple. I did what anyone would do, he said. She was just a kid who didn't deserve to die. Vixera tilted her head, a subtle gesture that suggested curiosity. You humans speak of selflessness as though it's the most natural thing in the galaxy. But where does it come from? Is it in your blood? David struggled to find words. He had no idea why he had done it. Maybe it was because he was a father once, or maybe because he'd always believed in protecting the helpless. But this was something far beyond the everyday sacrifices he had made before. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't about blood or genes, he replied. It's just what you have to do, whether you want to or not. Vixera seemed to ponder his words for a moment. She stared at him, her gaze never wavering. And now you sit in my ship, a prisoner, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Tell me, human, do you regret your choice? David's heart skipped. Regret? He had been a soldier, a man used to making hard choices. But this, no, not this. He hadn't protected that child for glory, and he hadn't done it for a reward. He had simply done what felt right. No, David answered quietly, his voice firm. I don't regret it. A strange expression crossed Vixera's face. It was fleeting, but David noticed it. The brief flicker of emotion that seemed almost human. But then it was gone, replaced by the coldness he had come to expect from her. She turned and walked to the door. You are fortunate that I find your actions intriguing, Vixera said. You have proven yourself more than just a simple human soldier. Perhaps you will be of use to me after all. David didn't know what she meant, but the feeling of dread in his gut grew. Use? How? Vixera paused at the door. There is more at stake than you realize. I'll explain later. And with that, she was gone. The following days were filled with silence, but the silence was not peace. David could sense the tension building on the ship. There was an energy in the air, an undercurrent of danger that he couldn't ignore. He had been a soldier long enough to recognize the signs of an impending conflict, and this was something much bigger than him. He spent the next few days observing the guards that were assigned to him. They were Exlor soldiers, tall, armored, and silent. They didn't speak to him, and he didn't attempt to speak to them. He had no idea what they were planning, but he could feel the weight of their eyes on him, as if they were waiting for something to happen. It wasn't until the fourth day that David finally got his answer. The door to his cell opened once again, but this time it wasn't Vixira who entered. Instead, a different Exlor soldier, a female, stepped inside. She was shorter than Vixira, with piercing green eyes and a cold expression. Her armor was different, a darker shade of green that blended with the shadows. "You're to come with me," she said, her voice sharp and direct. David didn't hesitate. He had learned long ago that defying the Exlor would only lead to unnecessary pain. He stood up slowly, his body still aching from the blaster wound, and followed her out of the cell. As they walked down the sterile hallways, David couldn't help but notice the tension growing. The crew of the ship seemed more frantic now, moving quickly, exchanging nervous glances. Something was happening. Something big. The soldier led him to a large chamber at the center of the ship. Inside, there were several Exlor leaders gathered around a large holographic map. Vixira stood at the center, her eyes locked on the display. She looked up when David entered, her expression unreadable. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing to a seat across from her. David obeyed, sitting down cautiously. "What's going on?" he asked. Vixira didn't answer at first. She continued to study the map, tapping a few buttons on the control panel. Then finally she spoke. "The Korvax," she said, her voice low but filled with anger. "They are coming." David furrowed his brow. He had heard rumors about the Korvax, an alien race feared throughout the galaxy for their brutal tactics and unrelenting wars. But he had never expected them to be this close. He had thought the Exlor were untouchable. "Who are they?" David asked. "They are an old enemy," Vixira replied, her voice hardening. "And they will destroy everything in their path unless we stop them." David's heart raced. The Exlor had a reputation for being merciless, but the Korvax, they were something else entirely. A species that had been wiped from the galaxy's history only to return with a vengeance. "What do you need me to do?" David asked, his voice steady. Vixira looked at him, her eyes cold and calculating. "You are not just a prisoner anymore. You are a soldier, and I need soldiers to help me stop the Korvax." David didn't know what to say. He was a prisoner, but he was also a man with a mission, one that went beyond his own survival. There was something bigger at play, and whether he liked it or not, he was now part of it. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. David's decision to protect that child had set him on a path he couldn't turn back from. The Exlor may have been his captors, but they were now his only hope. The coming war with the Korvax would decide everything, and David was about to find himself at the heart of it all. But as the darkness of space loomed ahead, David realized that the real enemy might not be the Korvax. It might just be the truth of his own situation. The days that followed were a blur of action and uncertainty. David, once a simple mechanic, had found himself drawn into a war that was far beyond anything he had ever imagined. The Exlor warship continued to sail through the vastness of space, heading toward a conflict that seemed inevitable. The Korvax, a race of savage warriors, had returned after centuries of silence, and they were heading straight for the heart of the Exlor Empire. David had been thrust into a world of strategy, battle plans, and high-stakes decisions. Commander Vixira, the ruthless leader of the Exlor, had placed him at the center of it all. She had given him a choice: help her stop the Korvax or remain a prisoner aboard her ship. But as the days passed, it became clear that his role was far more complex than he had initially thought. Vixira had started to treat him differently. She no longer saw him simply as a prisoner. She had begun to value his input, even if it was only for the purpose of fighting a common enemy. David wasn't sure whether it was respect or necessity, but the result was the same. He was no longer in his cell, but rather sitting at a command table with Vixira and her officers, discussing battle tactics. One day, as David sat in the war room, Vixira entered with a look of determination on her face. The holographic map in front of them displayed the coordinates of the Korvax fleet, and the mood among the X-Lore officers was tense. "This is it," Vixira said, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "The Korvax fleet is closing in. We have no more time to waste. We must strike now." David looked at the map, noting the size of the Korvax fleet. It was enormous, much larger than the X-Lore's own forces. The odds were stacked against them, and the battle ahead would be nothing short of deadly. "How do we stand a chance?" David asked, his voice serious. "Even with our best ships, the Korvax outnumber us." Vixira's eyes met his, her gaze hard but thoughtful. "We may be outnumbered, but we are not outmatched. The Korvax may have superior numbers, but they lack the unity we possess. We fight as one, human and X-Lore. Together we are stronger." David could see the glint of confidence in her eyes. She truly believed that. But did he? He had seen enough battles in his time to know that strength alone wasn't always enough to win. Strategy, timing, and the element of surprise often decided the outcome. "We need to hit them fast," David said. "Surprise them before they can organize. Target their leadership. Destroy their command structure." Vixira nodded slowly. "I agree. We will strike at their flagship. If we take it down, the rest of their fleet will crumble, but we will need someone to infiltrate their flagship. Someone who can get close enough to disable their command systems." David's heart raced. He had been expecting something like this, but the idea of sneaking into an enemy flagship was risky, even by his standards. The Korvax were ruthless and their ships were heavily guarded. Getting close to their command center would be a suicide mission for any regular soldier. "I'm not an infiltrator," David said, shaking his head. "I'm just a soldier. I don't have the training for something like that." Vixira's gaze softened slightly. "You may not have the training, but you have something that the Korvax do not expect. You have the element of surprise. The humans may be weak in numbers, but they are strong in courage and resourcefulness. You've proven that already." David's mind raced. He had no choice but to agree. If they were going to win this war, they would need every advantage they could get. But the risks were enormous, and there was no guarantee that he would make it out alive. "I'll do it," David said, his voice steady despite the anxiety building in his chest. "But I'll need help." Vixira considered this for a moment before nodding. "You'll have all the help you need. But be warned, human, this mission will not be easy. The Korvax will not give up their flagship without a fight, and even if you succeed, there's no guarantee that you'll survive." David looked at her, meeting her gaze for the first time with full understanding. He knew the risks. But in that moment he also knew that this was his chance to prove himself. Not just to the X-Lore, but to himself. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something greater. The next few hours were a blur of preparation. Vixira's officers began to make the necessary arrangements for the mission, gathering equipment and strategizing the best approach. Meanwhile, David was fitted with combat gear, his mind focused on the task ahead. He knew that if they were to have any chance of success, he would need to be quick, silent, and deadly. When the time came to board the X-Lore assault craft, David was ready. He stood alongside a small team of X-Lore soldiers, all of whom had been selected for their skills in infiltration and combat. They were an elite group, trained in the art of war, but David felt the weight of the mission on his shoulders. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the survival of his people and the survival of the galaxy itself. The assault craft launched from the X-Lore warship, its engines roaring as it sliced through space toward the Korvax flagship. As they neared the enemy vessel, David could see its immense size, the dark, menacing hull stretching out before him like a giant in the void. "This is it," Vixira's voice crackled over the comms. "Remember your training. Stick to the plan, and above all survive." David didn't answer. Instead, he focused on the task ahead. The craft shook as it entered the Korvax flagship's defenses, dodging fire from the enemy ships. It was a rough ride, but the craft's advanced shielding kept them protected for now. As they approached the flagship, the team prepared for their descent. David's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse racing as the countdown began. This was it, the moment of truth. If they could disable the flagship's command systems, the rest of the Korvax fleet would fall apart. But if they failed, it would be the end of everything. The craft landed with a jolt and the hatch opened. David led the charge, his weapon raised as he sprinted toward the flagship's interior. The team followed closely behind, moving swiftly through the dark corridors. each step bringing them closer to the heart of the enemy's power. But as they moved deeper into the ship, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The Korvax weren't known for their easy victories, and there was no sign of resistance. It was almost too quiet. Then, without warning, the ship's alarms blared, and the Korvax soldiers came charging from the shadows. David's instincts kicked in, and the fight for their lives began. The sound of blaster fire echoed through the darkened halls of the Korvax flagship. David's heart pounded in his chest as he ducked behind a corner, narrowly avoiding a deadly blast. His team was under fire from all sides, and it was clear that the Korvax had anticipated their assault. The element of surprise was gone, and now the battle was a fight for survival. David's mind raced as he signaled to his team to move forward. Their objective hadn't changed: disable the flagship's command systems and cripple the Korvax fleet. But with every passing second, it became harder to ignore the weight of the risk. He had no idea how long they could hold out against the onslaught, but he knew they had no choice but to press on. "Keep moving," David shouted over the comms, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We need to reach the command center." The team moved quickly, firing back at the Korvax soldiers who had appeared out of nowhere. The Korvax were relentless, their brutal tactics pushing the humans and X-Lore soldiers to the limit. But David didn't have time to think about how close they were to defeat. All he could focus on was the mission. As they moved deeper into the ship, the enemy resistance grew stronger. The corridors were narrow, the walls lined with enemy soldiers, each more dangerous than the last. David's mind was a blur of calculations: how to move, where to strike, and when to retreat. Every decision he made could mean life or death for his team. Then, without warning, they reached the heart of the flagship, the command center. The doors slid open with a hiss, and David rushed inside, his weapon at the ready. The sight before him was unlike anything he had ever imagined. The command center was a vast chamber, its walls lined with advanced technology that hummed with power. At the center of the room, a large console glowed with red lights, the heart of the flagship's operations. But standing between David and the console was a figure that made his blood run cold: Commander Vixira. She stood tall, her armor gleaming, her expression cold as ice. Behind her, the Korvax soldiers prepared for battle, their weapons aimed at the team. "You've come far, human," Vixira said, her voice calm but tinged with something more. Something dangerous. But this is where it ends. David's pulse quickened. He had expected to face the Korvax, but this was a twist he hadn't foreseen. Vixira, the one person he had trusted, was standing in his way. Her eyes locked with his, and for a moment he saw something flicker in her gaze, a flicker of doubt. "Why?" David asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Why are you stopping us? We're fighting for the same cause. The Korvax are a threat to both our people." Vixira's lips curled into a tight smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You misunderstand, human," she said softly. "This isn't about the Korvax. This is about something far bigger than either of us. The fate of the galaxy is not in your hands." David's mind raced, trying to piece together what she meant. What could be more important than defeating the Korvax? Was she playing some game with him? Or was there something else going on? Something deeper, more sinister? "What are you talking about?" David demanded. "This war is the only thing that matters right now. If we don't stop the Korvax, everything will fall apart." Vixira stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "You're right," she said. "The Korvax are a threat, but so are you. And so are your people." David's heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying?" "The humans," Vixira said, her tone turning icy. "You have no idea what you've unleashed. Your people are a virus, a plague. If left unchecked, you will destroy everything in your path." David took a step back, stunned by her words. "What? That's ridiculous." "We're not a plague." You think this is about the Korvax?" Vixira interrupted, her voice sharp. "No, human. This is about control. About keeping the galaxy in balance, and your kind, are a threat to that balance." David's mind was spinning. What was she saying? The X-Lore had always seen themselves as the superior race, but now she was telling him that humanity was a threat to the very structure of the galaxy? Before he could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the command center. David turned to see more Korvax soldiers entering the room, their eyes glowing with malice. They had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the final confrontation. Vixira turned to face them, her eyes steely. "Deal with them," she ordered coldly. The Korvax soldiers moved forward, but before they could strike, David acted. With lightning-fast reflexes, he grabbed one of the weapons lying on the floor and fired at the nearest Korvax soldier. The shot hit its target, but there were too many. The battle had begun in earnest. David's team fought back, their weapons blazing as they tried to hold off the Korvax soldiers. The room was chaos, blaster fire, shouting, and the clash of metal against metal. But through it all, David kept his eyes on Vixira. She was the key. If he could stop her, he could stop the Korvax. He moved toward her, his weapon raised, but Vixira was faster. She blocked his path, her blade coming out in a flash. The two locked eyes for a moment, and David could see the conflict in her gaze. She was torn between her duty to the X-Lore and something else, something that kept her from finishing the fight. "You don't have to do this," David said, his voice pleading. "We can still stop the Korvax together." Vixira hesitated, her grip tightening on her weapon. "It's too late for that," she said softly. "The path has already been set." With a swift motion, she raised her blade to strike, but just as she did, the room exploded in light. The console behind her flared with power, and the command center was filled with the deafening sound of the flagship systems shutting down. David's eyes widened as he realized what had happened. The Korvax had launched their final attack. Their weapon had fired, and the flagship was being torn apart from the inside. "We're losing control," one of the X-Lore soldiers shouted, panic in his voice. Vixira's face went pale as she turned back to the console. "No, this can't be happening." The flagship's systems were failing, and the Korvax had won. David stood frozen for a moment, the realization sinking in. The war was over, but at what cost? In that final moment, as the ship began to break apart, David made his choice. He ran toward Vixira, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her toward the escape pods. "Come on," he shouted. "We're getting out of here, now." Vixira looked at him, her eyes filled with confusion. "Why?" "Because," David said, his voice steady. "There's always a chance for redemption. Even for you." The two of them ran together, the ship collapsing around them as they made their way to the pod. The future of the galaxy was uncertain, but one thing was clear. David had fought for something greater than survival. He had fought for hope.